Modern. We're prepping for a voyage.
Modern.
The force of an old-fashioned equals whiskey mass times bitters acceleration.
Why don't you make that a double?
Modern bar cart.
What's shakin', cocktail fans? Welcome back to another episode of the Modern Bar Cart podcast. I'm your host, Eric Kozlik, and I want to thank you for joining me for this week's continuation of our deep dive into America's sweetheart spirit, bourbon. Since this is a two-part episode, I do recommend that you listen to last week's first, since in that episode we cover a lot of history, key terms, and some important label claims. So download that and give it a listen, or head on over to modernbarcart.com/podcast and look for episode 50, where you can stream it right from the show notes page and review some important highlights. In this episode, Capitol Hill resident bourbon expert Jordan Wicker and I dig into the flavor profiles of 5 different bourbons, all with differing proofs and mash bills, and we offer some of our favorite bourbon cocktail recipes for you to try as you build out your own collection. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't still give you an opportunity before the interview to make yourself a drink. That's right, this week's featured cocktail is the Toronto cocktail. Now, the official recipe for the Toronto cocktail actually involves Canadian whiskey, which makes sense, but there are a ton of versions of this cocktail that call for bourbon instead. So, what I'll do is I'll give you both versions and you can decide which sounds more appealing, which matches your flavor preferences more closely. The original Toronto cocktail recipe calls for 2 ounces of Canadian whiskey, a 1/4 ounce of Fernet, which is an extremely bitter Alpine liqueur from Italy, a 1/4 ounce of simple syrup, several dashes of aromatic bitters, and an expressed orange peel garnish. And this is a boozy drink served on the rocks, so you'll want to combine all those ingredients in a mixing glass with ice, stir for about 20 seconds or until it's properly chilled and diluted, and then strain into your rocks glass and express your orange peel garnish. Now, in my research, I also came across what's being billed as the new Toronto cocktail. And this recipe involves 1.5 ounces of bourbon, so slightly less, a 1/2 ounce of sweet vermouth, a 1/4 ounce of honey syrup, a single bar spoon of Fernet, which is a little bit less than a 1/4 ounce, more like 1/8 of an ounce, and then that same expressed orange peel garnish. Personally, that second version sounds like a lot of work. It's getting kind of closer to a Manhattan or a black Manhattan recipe with that sweet vermouth in there, and it sort of de-emphasizes the whole point of the cocktail, which is, in essence, hey, stick some Fernet in your old-fashioned. Yeah, you like that, don't you? I don't think the honey syrup or the sweet vermouth really add much in the new recipe, but I do think it's 100% okay to sub out the Canadian whiskey for bourbon, and in fact, that's the way you'll see the Toronto cocktail served in many of the best cocktail bars, partially because excellent Canadian whiskey still isn't as commercially available compared to the cheaper versions of it, which sometimes don't make a great cocktail. The beauty of the Toronto cocktail is that it's a really great way to start easing your way into Fernet without blasting yourself in the face with that bitterness. You've still got the familiar old-fashioned as your constant. The only thing that's different is you're adding a little flair and a little bitterness. If you find that even a 1/4 ounce of Fernet is too much, all you got to do is back down to a bar spoon, and then you can start to work your way up from there as you get more accustomed to that flavor. I find that depending on what bourbon you use for the Toronto cocktail, the mint notes in the Fernet actually make it a slightly more refreshing take on the old-fashioned, which usually isn't a criterion we associate with that particular cocktail. So, a little added bonus there. And now that you're plotting your next Toronto cocktail, let's jump in to this really fun bourbon tasting. Just a reminder that you can find over 100 podcast episodes featuring Jordan Wicker and his co-host Alex Luboff by searching for the Speaking Easy podcast wherever you go to download podcasts. We have links to a couple of excellent bourbon-related episodes by them in the show notes page for last week's episode, episode 50. But they don't stop at bourbon. They cover all kinds of fun cocktail-related topics, so be sure to give them a listen as well. And with that, I hope you enjoy this thoughtful and slightly tipsy bourbon tasting with bourbon aficionado Jordan Wicker. So that's a really good rundown of label claims. We've done a really good job on the history and kind of the place that bourbon has in American culture. I want to hit some cocktails, but I think what we can do is we can kind of taste our way through, and as we taste, let's do an initial tasting and then do a cocktail. Taste cocktail,
Okay.
Taste cocktail. Does that sound good?
All right. Yeah.
Cool. So what we're doing here, folks, is I'm going to just read off what we've got on the table, and I'll take a picture before I leave here so we've got them all lined up. But we've got Four Roses small batch, and what we're doing is we're going in ascending proof, basically. So we've got the small batch, which is, it looks like 45% alcohol, and so that's 90 proof. Then we've got a bottle of Larceny bourbon, which I'd never had before, so I picked that up, and that's 92 proof. That's a straight bourbon whiskey. Then we've got the Elijah Craig small batch. It's got the 12-year age statement on it. That's 94 proof, 47% alcohol. And then we do a pretty significant jump. We've got the last two are the Four Roses single barrel. That's a 50% alcohol by volume. It does not say bottled in bond, but it is 50% alcohol on the label there. And then we've got, finally at the end, the big bruiser here. We've got Maker's Mark cask strength, and that is 111.6 proof or 55.8% alcohol by volume. So we're gonna do that, and let's start off with the Four Roses small batch here.
Perfect.
So we do know that Four Roses, both of us know it. We both like it. I think it's a cocktail person's bourbon for sure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Again, it's one of my favorites. It's actually been a while since I've had a bottle on my bar, so I'm glad I had this excuse to get another one.
So take us through, how do you taste bourbon?
Okay, so that's this has actually come up recently, and I've been made fun of. We're drinking out of Glencairn or Glencairn like glasses. Those are like the quintessential iconic whiskey glasses.
They've got like a tulipy shape.
Yeah, tulipy shape, and what they have is that the kind of bulb at the bottom that holds the whiskey, and then it has a narrower top to it. So what that does is it concentrates the aroma
And the alcohol vapor.
and the alcohol vapor,
incidentally.
And so you want to approach it carefully, because again, you're gonna stick, if you stick your nose right in there like you do a wine, you're gonna burn all the aroma receptors in your nose in a way that's gonna make it hard to distinguish a lot of stuff. So I've been made fun of a couple times recently for this, but it is legitimate good advice, and that is when you smell whiskey, you want it close to your nose, but not in your nose in the glass, and you want your mouth open. You're going to be a mouth breather for this.
That's amazing.
And I'm sorry for those of you who understand the derogatory nature of that comment, but what it does is if you're breathing in and out of your mouth, you're not like sucking in all that alcohol vapor.
Right.
And what you're doing is allowing this more subtle notes to reach your nose and reach the receptors in your brain to actually recognize them.
Right.
So I'm thinking of it's Sideways with Paul Giamatti, where like he's teaching his friend how to drink wine, but he shoves his nose basically down to the bottom of the glass, and he spends like 2 minutes there. That's not necessary.
Yeah.
Again, I like to be anywhere from an inch to a half inch away from the glass, and kind of tip towards me, and I like to have my mouth open. And if you're uncomfortable with your mouth open because you feel like a fish or you feel like a dolt, what I'd say is at least open it enough where you're like kind of smiling, because you still want the air flowing in and out of your mouth and not your nose.
Right. Well, and another thing, I mean, this actually is very, very appropriate time-wise because it's a couple episodes. We launched an episode about how to properly taste spirits and cocktails. And so the mouth is the retronasal root versus the nose being the orthonasal root. So there's receptors both ways. And that's
So a lot of times when you look up tasting notes for whiskey, too, it'll be broken down into the nose, the mouth, and the finish. And so the nose is specifically that. It's before it's touched your lips. It's before it's touched your tongue. It's what you smell.
So what are you getting on this one?
So on this one, this is the
Four Roses small batch. I shouldn't have told you that.
Yeah.
You should just do it blind.
No, I'm not doing blind. I might be able to taste blind occasionally, but I can't. I don't think I can do it on nose. So for me, the small batch has, again, there's kind of like this constant note of vanilla at the bottom that just kind of runs throughout, and then I get the thing that I think is unique, or not unique, but augmented in the small batch is a fairly distinct honey note.
Mm-hmm. I almost get like a faint cherry or oats. Like I get like sweet oats and cherry on it.
So sweet oats is excellent. I say excellent just because I match with it. If you smell something or taste something different than me, that's
completely normal.
That's not a judgment. That's just completely normal. We have different palates. We know that.
Right.
And one of the things that I still struggle with is having the vocabulary to describe some of the things that I smell or taste in a whiskey or in a wine. I mentioned it early on. I pick my mom's brain all the time because part of it's sometimes I do have the palate to make those distinctions. I don't have the words to describe them.
Right.
And that's nothing to be embarrassed about either. That takes a lot of time nerding out about it. I really don't get. I know the cherry note that you're smelling because I taste it on the mouth, but I don't. But I don't get it on. I miss that on the nose. You do get a lot of fruitiness in this. And that's not so much on the nose, but for me, tasting it, you get the dark cherry, and you get. I think it's actually a fairly mild citrus, but you also get apricot and
I'm just getting that now.
Some other stone fruit kind of flavors, and then I think it finishes with some, again, that vanilla or that honey note that runs throughout. Then it finishes with that, and then you have brown sugar. I don't really get to. You get some of that toastiness. I wouldn't say. It doesn't get to burnt sugar or anything like that. And some of these I know for a fact that we will taste burnt sugar in. Cool. But one thing that this is just going to be me gushing about my mom again, so she'll have to listen to this episode. But the last time I tasted with her through a bunch of different stuff that was new to both of us, she was tasting the barrel in all of them, and she knew which cooperage. She knew which cooperage the stuff had been aged in. So, and there's only a handful of cooperages out there really that do this. In some places, cooperage for themselves, some big guys, but there's Zach and Calvin and Independent Stave. Independent Stave's a big one.
Yeah, they're big.
And they have locations in Kentucky and in Missouri and that sort of thing, but she's gotten to the point where she's tasting the nuance in the finished barrel out of the whiskey, and I'm like, that's
next level.
That's a goal that I will continue to practice so that I can achieve, because that's something else.
That's crazy. Yeah. And for folks listening, if you want to learn more about barrels and aging, check out our episode with Alice Blaine Allard of Free State Cooperage in Maryland. It's a really fun episode that we did with her. So learn more about barrels and aging there. But all right, so we got Small Roses, Small Roses. I'm looking at it. There's Small Roses on the label. We got 4 Roses small batch, and so kind of vanilla note running throughout. We've got a little bit of fruit on the nose and on the palate, and then as it finishes, it gets a little bit darker, a little bit sweeter. Mm-hmm. It's a really mellow finish. I really like it.
Yeah.
Very sippable, like you mentioned. Let's do a cocktail.
All right. So if I'm pairing something that tastes like this, and I didn't really start thinking about that until about 2 seconds ago. I really like this whiskey for a Manhattan. I really like this bourbon for a Manhattan. I like fairly strong Manhattans, and I think that I tend to stay away from lighter flavored sweet vermouths. But with this one, if you do have Dolan sitting around, I think it would pair well together.
Right, and there's that little cherry note in the bourbon, which is, kind of like suggestive of the brandied cherry. Whether you have a brandied cherry at home to put in your Manhattan or not, it's still suggestive of that. Yeah. And I do agree, like, if you were to say, put some Punta Mez in this, I don't know if I would do that because I feel like that would overshadow some of the fruity stuff in the bourbon.
And then this is not the vermouth episode, but my go-to vermouth is Carpano Antica, and I think that goes well in any Manhattan. So that would that'd be another suggestion there.
And bourbon is not the traditional spirit for the Manhattan. The traditional spirit is rye, but again, so one of the things that we found in this episode talking about the history is that bourbon is the replacement spirit in a lot of these, and
it is. And again, it is still American whiskey. It's still the aging process. All of those components are generally fairly similar. They will be different cocktails. If you make a rye Manhattan versus a bourbon Manhattan, you will get a different drink. But I drink a rye Manhattan as well. I do think that, again, this is just above 90 or at 90.
It's at 90.
90 exactly.
Yep.
I wouldn't make, me personally, I wouldn't make a Manhattan with something less than 90.
Yeah.
So you have like Basil Hayden's at 80 and a bunch of other stuff in the 80 to 90 category on the bourbon. And 80 is the lowest that you can bottle a bourbon at.
Right.
And I just don't think they hold up. I don't think cocktails are best served at the lowest level that the alcohol provides. And particularly, I'm a big whiskey drinker, so I like that to be a robust flavor that comes from that alcohol. But yeah, I think that if you get above 90, a bourbon does a lot of the similar things that rye does, and it also will provide a little bit of. It'll be a slightly sweeter cocktail than a rye, particularly a high rye. But again, there's difference there, but difference is good.
Yeah, difference. We're not. It's qualitative. It's not. We're not ranking this.
Yeah,
a bourbon Manhattan is just as good.
I mean, in all fairness, I think that if I had to pick rye or bourbon for my Manhattan for the end of time, it'd probably be a rye. But again, I'll certainly make a bourbon Manhattan at least once a week.
Yeah, for sure. It's like kind of like when you like your stepdad. It's technically like it's not the original, but it's like, all right. So cool. So we got a Manhattan. We've got Four Roses small batch. Let's take just a baby step up in proof, just 0.5%, or no, 1 full percent to 92. We're gonna do the Larceny, and this is Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey, very special small batch. Reminds me of NCIS Very Special Agent Anthony Donoso. And this says distilled and bottled by Old Fitzgerald Distillery, Bardstown, Kentucky. 40004, palindrome of zip code. Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, so again, another contract distillation.
Yeah, so this is... I had a little bit of this earlier. So you were sipping on the small batch. I was sipping on a little bit of this earlier. And... yeah. Just getting the nose of it here. It's definitely, it's immediately different. And actually, if you hold them up, it looks a little darker in color than the small batch.
Yeah, they're actually very similar in color, but it's slightly darker. But actually, that's one thing we didn't vary significantly. And there's less variation, I think, in bourbon and its color than most things, unless you get, again, straight whiskey means that it color can't be added. So all that color is coming from the barrel. If it's not straight, sometimes color is added
with those bouillon cubes.
I don't
or
think,
something,
I don't,
or something like
yeah, I think that these days it's with food coloring. But yeah, no, that's one thing that I think is also something that people don't realize if they've never been to a distillery is bourbon like rye, comes off the still, clear like water, or it should be. And then it's the aging process. It's the char on the barrel. It's the barrel itself that give it the caramely, golden rays of sunshine color.
Right. So I'm getting more cereal notes on this. When I say cereal, I'm talking about the grains used to distill it. You're not going to see a ton of bourbons talking about their mash bill, are you?
No, they're not. Yeah, they're not going to have it on the label very often.
Right.
Actually, Four Roses publishes all their mash bills.
Yeah, they're great like that.
And they're great like that. And then if you ask most distilleries, they don't hide it. Some of them will tell you the mix of grains and not the percentages, but a lot of them will just tell you the percentages. Some folks will say it's a trade secret or something like that, but for the most part, the mash bill, somebody could take the same mash bill you have and create a completely different whiskey with it.
Right. There's a lot of other factors.
There's plenty of other factors in it. So it's one component. So if you have something incredibly novel, maybe it's worth hiding. But
yeah,
I at least like to know that they're going to tell me the grains that are in it. If it's a 4 grain is fairly uncommon. So typically speaking, bourbon is obviously majority corn. Typically there's some rye and or wheat, and then occasionally there's barley. And some of these, some of them will have no wheat. Some of them will have a lot of times you'll see a wheated bourbon is another term you'll see. A wheated bourbon generally means that there's more wheat than there is rye, or there's only wheat.
And we have one of those on the table.
Maker's is actually obviously an incredibly popular bourbon, and it has no rye in it. It has wheat. But three grain mash bills are fairly common. So corn on all of them. Wheat and rye tend to interchange, and barley is occasional in some of them.
So rarely do you see all 4 playing.
Rarely do you see all 4 playing together. There are examples out there. There just had one last night. Wiggle out of Pittsburgh has a 4 grain, and a lot of times if you have a 4 grain bourbon or other whiskey, they'll be proud of that, and they'll put that on the label. They'll put that in the marketing. They'll say it's a 4 grain. Because it's a novelty thing. And again, doesn't indicate quality. It probably does indicate something about the flavor profile.
It probably also indicates something about the size of the batch, because that's never going to be a massive. It's never going to be like a keystone product for someone.
I don't think so,
unless they're very small.
Yeah, right. I think that'd be right. I'm trying to think of a big producer that has a 4 grain.
So what are you getting on the larceny here? I get the cereal notes. I feel like there's probably a decent amount of rye in here.
Yeah, no, it's definitely there's spice on the front end for me. More cinnamon and clove.
Yeah, I get like a very like almost like clove in the distance.
Yeah. I'd say
people call that baking spice, right? In many cases.
Yeah, people.
That's a very.
I've used baking spice before as a term when I'm not exactly sure what combination of spices or what spices in particular that I'm smelling, and it reminds me of cookies or something like that. I'm like, that's baking spice.
Yeah.
I think it's that mix of like cinnamon, clove,
maybe a little nutmeg and or ginger.
Maybe some ginger, nutmeg. A lot of times nutmeg gets called out on its own, but again, I usually use baking spice when I'm not exactly sure which spices I'm smelling.
Yeah, it's a bit of a cop-out term, admittedly.
I think it's legitimate, and you'll see it in a lot of tasting notes. So I don't want to say that it's not a real thing. It is a real thing because I've smelled it before, and a lot of other people do too. And I'm not going to say that it's a lack of nuance. I think that there are times where you can't distinguish the notes between
some
spices.
Is greater than
because
it's
not like there's clove floating around in the barrel. It's not like there's cinnamon floating around in the barrel. So what you're smelling is the as if cinnamon, as if clove were floating around in the barrel. And so I can understand at times that it's going to be as if some mixture of spices was floating around, and it's going to be really hard to pull out which ones.
For sure. On the palate for the Larceny, it's much darker than the Four Roses, and I don't notice the alcohol as much. So it's technically a little bit more boozy. It's 92 proof as opposed to 90, and so I don't actually get the booze, and I don't get the fruit. This is I get like the cereal throughout. So if the vanilla was the backbone of the small batch, I think the cereal, the rye, and a little bit of that baking spice is the backbone.
Yeah, I get the spices are strong throughout here. I get a little bit of brown sugar kind of towards the tail end, and I get a lot of dry citrus peel, so particularly orange. But
yeah,
and again, we're getting into the territory of coming across as like pretentious wine drinkers, but again, it's just drinking a lot and pulling out nuance and then trying to come up with the words to describe it.
Well, and honestly, the reason why we're doing this too is like, if you're sitting out there listening on your commute or at your desk or on your run, like, listen, like, do you think you could get like a group of your friends to get together and do this with you? Like, probably not. So, maybe this is not the most stimulating or like, because you can't see the bottles and smell what we're smelling and taste what we're tasting. It might not be as genuine, but hopefully what you're getting from this is like the way to have a conversation about flavor with people. So that when you do get that opportunity, then you can kind of like, feel more confident about it, I guess. That's why we're, we like to do this.
Yeah, I'm gonna boldly say, not 100% sure that I'm accurately describing what I'm tasting, but I also think I get plum. I think I get plum on this at the tail end,
like a plum skin.
Yeah, like a plum skin. So yeah.
Well, there's a little bit
not
of
like the meat of the fruit, but yeah.
A little astringency in there.
Yeah.
I think you get a little bit of astringency when you like chew on the skin of the plum. So what would you make with this? Like, do you have a cocktail picked out for this? If you don't, I kind of have a couple.
If you have one specifically picked out for this, I'll let you take it.
I'm thinking a Boulevardier would be really nice with this. Yeah. Especially because you were, hinting at that, little dried orange peel. And so for folks out there, the Boulevardier, if you're not familiar with it, it's the whiskey version of the Negroni. So it's a perfect ratio. It's a 1:1:1 ratio of spirit, in this case, bourbon, to Campari, which is the bitter Italian aperitivo, and sweet vermouth. So again, as always, the sweet vermouth is kind of up in the air. It's what you got. For this, I might like a nice Carpano Antica because it's going to balance out some of those cereal and malty and spicy notes that we get, and actually also play up the orange in there, which I think could bear to be played up a bit.
Yeah, no, I agree. And then I'd say unlike the Manhattan, I'd put Punta Mez in there as well. But dealer's choice.
Yeah, it's what you have.
You certainly don't need 3 bottles of sweet vermouth sitting open in your fridge because you're trying to match it to cocktails all the time.
Though honestly, the way I do it is Dolan is my warm weather vermouth, Carpano Antica is my transition weather vermouth, and Punta Mez is my cold weather vermouth. Because Punta Mez is dark, assertive, a little bit brooding. Carpano Antica is just like spring and fall are my 2 favorite seasons, and so it's nice to have just this immaculate product there and pay a little bit more for it. And then in the summer, if I'm making a dark drink, I'd like it to be a little bit lighter. That's a really great role for the Dolan to play.
I almost never buy Dolan sweet vermouth. I buy the dry stuff all the time. It's actually my go-to dry vermouth.
It's really good.
Right now I have Koki in the fridge. That's another thing. This is general notes for another show, but I always keep my vermouth after opened refrigerated.
Yes.
And I try to drink it inside of 3 weeks.
I think that should go on our 10. It probably goes on some 10 commandments of cocktails somewhere.
It's a wine base, and it's not high proof, so it does, like a vinegar, go bad. So
so far we've talked about a nice bourbon Manhattan. We've talked about a Boulevardier, which is a great drink to be able to batch as well. Before we move on here, we're pouring the Elijah Craig small batch. But one note I will make about the Boulevardier is that, man, if you are entertaining and you've got yourself a bottle of bourbon, a bottle of Campari, and a bottle of sweet vermouth, man, you can entertain. Like, you could literally dump all 3 of those bottles completely in one pitcher and then add, do the math, figure out what 20% dilution is to that.
Yeah.
Take your gallon, right? We already told you to go out and buy your distilled water. If you do the math and figure out what 20% of that total volume is, add that amount of water to it in a pitcher, and then add a bunch of bitters, what bitters to taste almost. You can kind of add those to taste, a splash at a time as you're stirring it together, and then sit that in the fridge. It's as if you've shaken or stirred that cocktail, but you did it the morning before, and then when your friends arrive, you have a pitcher of Boulevardiers, and that's freaking fantastic.
Yeah.
You're a hero. That's legitimate hero.
No, those are good tricks of the trade, because again, after you've thrown so many cocktail parties, you realize that you don't want to mix every Boulevardier by hand,
right?
And also being able to start somebody, especially if you're having a small group of folks over, it's really great to have at least a bottle cocktail then to start everybody off with, because then there's no immediate slowdown. There's no immediate bottleneck. You can go from that cocktail, and then again, if you've batched everything, like say you're having a nice dinner for a handful of friends, like it's great to start them with something light and maybe effervescent before everybody sits down. I love to go with a French 75 or something like that, or a spritz, sure. And then something a little bit more boozy, but dangerously boozy. So something that's got a decent amount of complexity of flavor that kind of masks the booziness of it when you're getting into the entree. And there's any number of drinks that'll do that. I like Trinity cocktails, and both the actual cocktail Trinity, and then but anything that's equal parts or something like that. Sure. And then you get into the end of the meal, the dessert cocktail, and that's where I say ratchet it up the booziness and make it something dark and rich and robust, and knock them out with a really fantastic Manhattan, or I mean, if you're going the other direction and you're doing clear spirits, the best martini you've ever made, kind of
for
thing.
Sure, for sure. Yeah, and bourbon's a great utility player, and I feel like everything on this table right now could play some sort of role in what you just described. So having multiple bourbons, like if if you've listened to what we've said so far, if you haven't already tuned out, then probably what's going through your mind is like, all right, maybe I want to start hitting some of these various different kind of price points and quality points, and using them differently in my cocktail experiences. So I'll be honest, smelling this Elijah Craig small batch is way different than any of the 2 that we've tasted so far. And I'll go ahead and say, way better. Yeah. Not that those 2 weren't bad at all. They were perfectly pleasant, but this is, what do you get?
So, here I do get cherry on the nose with Elijah Craig small batch.
Is cherry common for bourbon? Because I never hear it bandied about.
Nah, I think it is. And this is something about my palate that I know, is I think that I perceive cherry more often than most people. So that's a piece of my palate that is either extra strong and I pick it up when it's there and other people don't notice it, or I imagine it when it's not there. One of the 2. But I get it a lot, and some of my favorite bourbons, including Elijah Craig small batch, have strong hints of cherry. One bottle that I wasn't able to pick up before this, that is one of my go-to $30 bottles, is Henry McKenna 10-year bottled in bond. And it was the first bourbon that I had where I poured a glass, and the first thing that hit me was just dark cherry notes, and I was just like, this is great. This is one of my favorite. To this day, it's one of my favorite bottles, and it's $30.
Yeah,
it's great, it's readily available. It's one of those bottles that you can find, I think, in all 48 state, lower 48, and I mean, maybe not in every liquor store, but it should be there somewhere. And it's just a good robust. Again, great for cocktails, but also just really great for sipping.
I almost get a little bit of floral notes on the nose as well. I don't know if I'm not great at identifying floral scents. And floral scents, to be fair, are not super common in like bourbon. It's not going to be usually the first thing you pick up on a bourbon in the same way it might be with a gin or like a tequila or something like that.
Yeah, usually they're much more subtle, and usually they're fleeting. Usually you get them right there at the top end, and maybe when you drop that little tiny eyedropper of worth of water in, you kind of pick up on it. If you open this up a little bit, I guarantee you smell more of it. I say open up meaning add water or an ice cube or something like that. Yeah, I
get corn.
Yeah. No. Yep. The corn sweetness. Corn.
Yeah.
I don't really get cornbread, which is something that you sometimes pick up. Is kind of that like. Just cornbread. I mean, I was going to try to go into more detail, but if you had cornbread, but no, you do
toasted. It's a little bit more toasted than the corn note.
Yeah, no, you get kind of a raw corn,
which is great. I mean, that's like I feel like right now everything's starting to open up. It was warming up outside, and I'm starting to dream about those fresh vegetables and fruits that are coming in like about another month or two. So like that note of corn actually just like really enticed me.
You still get a decent amount of spice, but not nearly as upfront as the Larceny. I
get a bit more of the booze. I'm actually feeling the booze like appropriately more on this one. I feel like the Larceny was hiding a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's true. I also think we're on our third glass of whiskey, so
we've been pretty modest about. I made sure that before we did this, I hydrated all afternoon.
Oh, all right. Well, you're a better man than I am.
So we've hit kind of like we've got the Manhattan, we've got a Boulevardier.
So I've got one for this. I've actually got there are a couple of drinks that I really like to make with
all
this
right,
one, but I'll
hit us with one.
For me, this is Whiskey Smash.
Yes.
So
that's so good, especially with the seasonal stuff we were just talking about.
Yeah. So I'm not a huge fan of a mint julep, to be honest, but I am of a Whiskey Smash. And essentially, a Whiskey Smash is a tarted up mint julep.
Right. It's like a mint julep and a whiskey sour ran into one another.
Yes, exactly. But Elijah Craig 12-year-old bourbon is like the one that I have written down in one of my many cocktail notebooks that end up being almost useless because I can never find them when I'm looking for them. But Elijah Craig for this, and then also one of my go-to old fashions is an Elijah Craig 12-year.
Sure.
Whiskey Smash is half a lemon, 4 mint leaves, 2 ounces of bourbon, 3/4 ounce simple syrup, and muddle the mint with the simple.
Squeeze the lemon.
And squeeze the lemon in. I like to leave the rind of the lemon in as well. Some people will comment about...
in the shaker, correct?
Yeah. In the shaker. So you're combining all that in a shaker, adding ice, shaking that up really good, beating the crap out of it. People will occasionally comment that they think that leaving it in creates some extra bitterness. I don't think it's true. Like I mean, if anybody who's licked a rind will know the bitterness you're talking about. Like
it happens. I think if anything, it gets the oils in.
But
there, you know?
But no, like again, I like the added oils from the rind, and I think that again, moving it as far away from the mint julep with the sugar, the mint, and the bourbon, the more lemon that's out there for me is a good call.
That's great.
But
you probably also like the Southside cocktail, huh?
I do.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that's very similar. What's the difference is that the mint is not really as emphasized.
You know what? You've tested me, and I'm not gonna remember.
I know. I don't know myself, but you know, this kind of goes to show that wherever there's like, if you come across a cocktail you like, folks, and I was at an event last night at McClintock Distilling, and there was a bartender there named Jeff who made this point. You know, if there's a cocktail you like, chances are there's 3 or 4 cocktails that sprout right off from it that are just different enough for you to you kind of branch out and explore and just get something slightly different and exciting in that way. And chances are you probably don't have to buy all that many new ingredients to make them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, that's something that we preached all the time on Speaking Easy, was that once you have a baseline for a couple categorical cocktails, slight modifications are the next 30 or more.
Right. Sometimes it's actually harder to find the name than to make the modification. Right.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I just made you this whiskey Negroni. It's like, oh, well, yeah, it's a Boulevardier, but
right.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I still don't think there's a standard name for the mezcal version of that, and I'm glad that there's not, because I call it something new every time.
For sure.
But you get that a lot, where you hit a couple variations that seem like common sense variations that don't really have the standardized name about them. I'm a big fan of the Boulevardier. It's one of my favorite drinks, and I really like to switch out the Campari for Cynar, which is another.
Is that the Old Pal or the Man About Town?
That's the Man About Town.
Man About Town.
Yeah, and like that drink, I think even more. Cynar is a common replacement for any other bitter in my repertoire. It's earthy and vegetal.
Yeah,
and
vegetal.
But anyway, we. Going on a long tangent about something that's not bourbon, so maybe we pull it back.
Sounds good. So we've got two more. So I think what we've got now is we've got the heavy hitters.
Yeah.
And so we've got kind of the apex. Well, probably not the apex. I'm sure it's not the apex. In fact, I'm sure Four Roses has a ton of small and cask projects.
They do. So the step above the Four Roses single barrel is kind of their single barrel distiller select.
Mm-hmm.
So they have, and I don't remember if they actually do anything.
That's the one. The distiller literally he sleeps in the same bed with, like, he puts the barrel in his bed.
It's basically that he's picking like a couple barrels a year and saying these are my barrels.
Yeah.
And
I'm
pretty sure you can only get that stuff at the distillery, or
sure
maybe a small radius outside the distillery, but.
So my experience getting this bottle, I'll tell you, I picked this up at our common liquor store. The nice thing about this podcast is I literally just had to walk out my door and go a few blocks. So we share a liquor store geography, and we both know the glory that is Schneider's of Capitol Hill, and some of the idiosyncrasies therein. But it's a really great establishment, and they actually were able to, when the rep came in with this barrel, they actually got to pick which barrel. They had a choice between several, and they picked this one specifically for their store. So I think that's kind of a cool little story, just a little added aspect of the story that really drew me in. They had it on sale, and so I was like, well, yeah, it's kind of cool, and I trust the brand, so let's do this. And like I said, this is basically our bottled in bond on the table.
Yeah.
It doesn't say it on the label, but it's 50%.
Yeah. Again, another one that I like quite a bit. I've got a couple bottles tucked away somewhere.
Is it weeded?
So I know this is
very light on the nose.
It is really light on the nose, and I know it's 35% rye because it says that on the barrel or on the bottle. It says that it was aged 9 years and 1 month. I would be really surprised if it doesn't have 5% wheat in it, but I don't know that.
I made the mistake of reading the little card that was attached to it, and it had all the tasting notes on it.
Did it? Did it tell you if there's wheat in it or not?
No, it didn't say anything about the mash bill, but now I'm irritated because the tasting notes are kind of...
okay.
They're not good tasting notes.
Okay.
It's just all like sweet. It's honey, maple.
Yeah.
I don't really appreciate those kind of tasting notes because it's just different variations of sweetness. Like if you pick one up organically, I like it. But if someone is like, yeah, so you'll taste like the honey and the it's like you just kind of said like two versions of the same thing.
Yeah. So, yeah, and this is actually something too that I think is very noticeable in a lot of. And I'm sorry, I'm stepping away from the microphone too much. I think that is noticeable in some of these single barrels from Four Roses is you actually get, and I actually haven't tasted this one yet, so I might be speaking out of turn, but you actually taste the oakiness. I get barrel more out of these single barrel projects often than I do with some of the blends, and I don't know if that's I don't
get
know
a
if
little
that,
bit of cedar on the nose. Now that you say that, cedar being kind of the presence of the resin in the wood. Not there's a lot of resin in oak, but it's it's tannins and there's chemicals in there that I'm not qualified to identify.
Yeah, I don't know that I would have been able to peg cedar, but there's a recognizable flavor that I recognize as oak barrel.
Sure,
that's definitely there.
On the palate, to me, this is so far the best of the four that we've had.
Oh,
Subjectively,
I don't disagree with you. And this is one where I would tell you we're going to talk about cocktails on it.
Yeah,
I would tell you don't.
Diminishing returns for sure.
Yeah.
There's one I do want to hit before we go. I won't say what it is yet. Maybe we'll wait for the cast strength and then we'll drop it. I think that might be a better one. But talk about why one might not want to make a cocktail.
Because you can make an equally good cocktail with a quality whiskey that's cheaper. That's usually the calculus that's in my head.
Right.
This is a whiskey that I think has enough complexity and nuance in it that it's enjoyable to drink, and to study, on its own.
If you've ever made a delicious meal for someone and then they squirted ketchup all over it.
Right.
That feeling is the feeling that the distiller would get watching you make a cocktail with something as special as this.
Right. And to be honest, I don't like those sorts of distinctions. I have preferences because, again, I have enough whiskey to have significant preferences on which whiskeys I'm using for what, and this is one of those bottles that I'd prefer to sip because I have other options, that sort of thing. But if what you wanted was to make a cocktail out of this, I would, again, you want to I do think that you don't want to hide the whiskey, so you don't want to add in something super bitter like a Campari or a Cynar or anything like that. I also don't think that you want to add any citrus to it. If you do, it's got to be light and it's got to be almost garnish. And
this might just be the best old fashioned that you ever had.
So an excellent old fashioned is one. I'd really be hard pressed to go beyond that, but you could make a pretty intriguing Manhattan out of this as well.
For sure.
You could also, there's something called a Louisville cocktail, Louisville for those of you who don't know how to read, but
Louisville for those of you who aren't from here.
Yeah, and that is, if I remember right, it's 2 parts bourbon, a half. I think it's a half part.
So 4 parts bourbon, 1 part.
4 parts bourbon. So 2 ounces bourbon.
Yeah,
half ounce of Lillet Rouge and a half ounce of Lillet Blanc.
Okay, so it's almost like the perfect Manhattan's kind of French cousin.
Yeah, it's like the perfect Manhattan's. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Right.
Yeah.
So we've got so you're at the end. You've got
that's so
1
funny
ounce.
that's so funny because I always forget about the perfect Manhattan. I forget that it's out there. I forget that people put dry vermouth in a Manhattan ever. But yes, you're right.
It's actually been something I've been getting more into, especially with our heritage collection of bitters, because there's some stuff like the liquid gold ancient trade bitters that are so kind of crazy, and they have such obvious applications with clear spirits, but when I want to put it in a boozy cocktail with a dark spirit, I need the little bit of dryness and acidity that's in that dry vermouth to help just kind of even things out a little bit. So it actually makes a really great dry bourbon Manhattan with the liquid gold. So that's we're going to be putting recipes up for that soon on the website. But
Nice.
it's
Nice.
Yeah.
I've actually, out of the early bottles that you gave me, when it comes to the dry vermouth side, I've really enjoyed the Japanese bitters. I've been playing with dry vermouth and the Japanese for the Ike.
the Ike Japanese bitters.
Those. I'm just thinking about. I mean, Lillet is not exactly vermouth, but it's close enough. And
Right.
So when we're talking about that, that's what came to mind. But.
Cool. And folks, we're going to put all of these recipes, from the Manhattan to the Boulevardier to, the Louisville cocktail, the whiskey smash, and all these things that we're mentioning. We'll have recipes for these on the show notes page at modernbarcart.com/podcast. But I think now it's time to tackle this bad boy.
Yep.
So we've got the Maker's Mark cask strength, and I saw the makers on the table, and when I walked in, I was happy. I was like, oh, good, we've got a wheated. I was like happy to have the wheated bourbons represented, and then I turned it around and saw the cask strength, and I was like, oh snap.
Well, it's still wheated.
Yeah. So can you tell us anything about the Maker's cask strength?
Yeah. So it is exactly as it sounds. It is the same Maker's Mark recipe that you probably know, but instead of cutting it down in proof, they pour it out of the cask. This one is 111.6 proof.
So you're getting what it comes out of,
actually,
of the barrel at.
I mean, yeah, it's exactly what it comes out of the barrel. I don't think they do any cutting whatsoever. Usually that's what, again, I don't think cask strength is regulated that closely. And they might, if anybody does anything, what they're doing is adding water to smooth the flavor just a little bit. But I don't know that they even do that with this.
Right. And you do see, and I don't know if this is actually handwritten on the label, because the writing is very, very neat. So they might just have a really excellent stamp, but they, at the very least, give the illusion of...
I think it... I don't know. Maybe it's not, but...
I think it might be.
But anyway, but cask strength is also one of those terms. It's often like Navy strength is to rum, where it just means high proof, but it doesn't mean a specific high proof.
Right.
This also, yeah. So this is coming out of a barrel, so it's also like kind of by default a single barrel. But yeah, it's but yeah, cask strength. I have got cask strength in the house that's like 136 proof.
Right. It depends.
So it can go. Again, usually it's over 110. I don't think it comes out of the barrel really less than that very often. And for me, this is a great lesson in kind of the high proof versus low proof in flavor versus less flavor kind of thing. Is there are a lot of decisions that go into what proof a distiller decides to bottle at, and a lot of times it has to do with inventory and supply and these things, but it also has to do with we mentioned consistency. It oftentimes plays into a consistency of flavor or a particular flavor that they're trying to reach or match, and they do so by cutting the proof. And what I would say though is if you have a really, really tasty, complex, high proof whiskey that you can't do the proof on. You just, for whatever reason, you don't like it that high proof, or you don't want it that high proof, versus a whiskey that has less complexity, has less nuance, has less flavor, but is the right proof for you. My best recommendation is take that distilled water and cut it. Because what you're not going to lose. you're going to soften it. It's going to open up a little bit more, but you're not going to lose those layers of flavor.
Yeah, you're going to get what you want, but then you're not going to like destroy what the distiller intended.
Yes. Yeah. You're going to get the flavor that was meant to come out of that bottle. And you're not and you can do so without going to something less. And so a lot of people, I mean, you see a lot of people bully people when they see a nice whiskey with water added. I sit at Jack Rose all the time, and I always ask for the little eyedropper bottle, whether I use it or not. And you'll have a knucklehead or two that are like, "Oh, you're drinking it with water," and I'm like, "Yeah, I am." And you shouldn't feel bad about that. I mean, I don't tend to, when I'm tasting things for tasting notes or to work on my palate or to pull stuff apart, I don't tend to put things on ice. I like them more or less at room temperature, but
sure. That's partially controlling for variables, right?
Yeah.
Ice is a variable, just like alcohol can burn your nose.
The quality of the ice, the temperature of the ice, all of those things play into it. I also have just gotten very used to not drinking it with ice, and so I don't. But drinking it with ice is not wrong. Nobody should feel like they're doing something wrong by drinking whiskey on ice. I personally, I would prefer that the ice is very clean, clear ice, sure, and not adding limestone or whatever flavors to your whiskey. But
yeah, my favorite is just on one single large rock, so it dilutes slowly, and I can sip it at my own pace.
So for one, again, I have a couple of bottles here that are really high proof stuff, and I drink those either super, super slowly, or I put them on a rock, and over time they soften, and
sure,
and I can drink them at a more reasonable pace. And again, there's no wrong way there. It's all preference. People will tell you you're doing it wrong, but as long as you're enjoying it, it's all right.
Yeah, the interesting thing
until you put ketchup
cocktails,
on your steak, though.
Yeah,
so
well,
they're
exactly. The nice thing about cocktailing is that it's an individual sport and also a team sport. When it's convenient, it is both types of sports, and the joy is sharing it. But the actual work gets done when you're making cocktails on your own, experimenting. So let's talk about this cask strength. So we got a wheated bourbon here. In general, what does one get from a wheated bourbon that might be different than a high rye bourbon?
So there are two things about this one in particular. This is not only wheated, but it has no rye. The origins of makers were basically that there was all this bourbon with the heavy rye notes in it, and the distiller was like, I don't want that. I want something completely different. So he took all the rye out, replaced it with wheat. You tend to get more sweetness. Again, it's either more sweetness or the absence of the spice that you notice. It doesn't have the rye bread characteristics. It doesn't have most of the time. It doesn't have the baking spice notes. And you pick up I think more honeys, sometimes maple syrup.
Sure. I get a little bit of hay sometimes. So it's weird. You actually taste the wheat in there.
Yeah. No, but you get hay. You get sometimes you mentioned floral earlier. Because it's lighter in its flavor and on the nose, sometimes you get more floral.
And this is going to sound stupid and pretentious because it is, but with a wheated bourbon, this is, at the most elite level of giving tasting notes. This is the difference between an orange blossom honey and a Tupelo honey. Mm-hmm. And it sounds absurd. And I hope that everybody listening
I don't even know the distinctions between those honeys, but I just know that the analogy you drew is probably right.
Right. Yeah. And I hope that people do recognize that as absurd, because that's not the point. But for people who actually, people like your mom who actually do, get so intimate with it, these are the distinctions that they're drawing, and they're drawing them so that you don't necessarily have to, so that you can just enjoy it. So for this, I'll tell people what I did. So I saw the super high proof. and I was drinking out of one of the more Glencairn glass with the tulip, and I was like, nah, I'm gonna fry my nose because my nose is really big, and there's a lot of smell receptors in there, and so I was like, if I stick my nose in there, I'm just gonna burn my nose hairs off. So I transferred it to this more like a traditional rocks glass, and when I hold it up to my face, and I take a nice deep breath in the way that you instruct it with the mouth open, I get lots of flavor, but I don't get alcohol. But when I leave my eyes open above it, the alcohol vapors burn my eyes, which is like a really bizarre thing to like not be able to smell it, but it's like they're radiating off the bourbon. And then you definitely get it on the palate. So why don't you take us through what we get on the palate with this?
I think the big distinctions here are, again, a real absence of most of the spice notes. There's still spice there, but
it's mostly alcohol burn. Like if you let the burn wear off.
But what I do think you get, I mentioned burnt sugars. I think that there's a lot more caramel. I think there's a lot more honey. Honey's a weird one. It's one that for me just kind of denotes like base level sweetness. It's like an off dry wine where there's no sugar added, but you get the inherent sweetness of the corn or some other ingredient in it.
For sure.
I get notes of char and of toasted oak. And even a little bit of like you get like a wheat bread toast.
Yeah.
Kind of like you left it in the toaster. It gets a little bit of char. So it's you got that carbon in there. That's what I get a lot of that. I get like a whole wheat toast in this.
See, I'm getting a lot of lighter notes. I'm getting like some like almost like a lemon zest and definitely honey as well. I think honey is like there for sure. It's actually surprisingly sweet to me for the proof that it is. It's also very dark. I think it's one of the it's probably the darkest on the table.
Yeah, it's
but yeah, it's weird that I'm getting the very light notes and you're getting the darker ones.
Yeah. No, but there's definitely that. So another thing that I notice in this is, it's not. You don't get, or I don't get biscuits. You'll hear biscuits as something that gets mentioned. You don't get biscuits. There is to me. There's just a little bit of butteriness.
Sure.
Not a ton. It's not dairy butteriness. It's that oily, like fatty butteriness.
Oh, that's such a weird distinction that we won't get into here, but it's a really cool distinction to draw.
Well, it's an important distinction to draw. I will just say that it's a flavor that I've noticed before when you get, and you won't find this in big producers. There's not a bottle that we have on the table. I can only think of one bottle in my collection at the moment, maybe two that could even possibly have it, but a strong dairy note. That note of sometimes it just comes across as sweetness and you don't identify it as dairy right away, but a sweetness, a dairy, it means that there's something wrong in the distillation. I'll say that much.
That's good. It's a good little tip for people.
You're not going to find it in one of these big producers. Like they take care of business. It's not going to go wrong there. Some of the smaller places, it's an imperfection in the distilling, but there is butteriness that comes from, again, there's a chemical compound that I should remember now because I've heard my mom or somebody else mention it multiple times, but the same thing with like the rye bread. There's a chemical compound that gives you that rye bread flavor.
Just like there's esters in rum and
but there's one that really denotes that fatty butter flavor that I taste in this. And again,
neat.
It's subtle. It's you definitely taste it more in other bourbons.
I actually get it on the finish.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like if you ever had buttered toast, like nice dark buttered toast, you take a bite of that and it's like the aftertaste of that slightly on the finish.
Yep.
That's pretty cool. One thing that does surprise me is that it didn't like bite my face off at a significantly higher proof, and I think part of that is the weededness. and not having that spicy rye in there. But
and it's got a decent. I don't remember what this is aged to, and it doesn't say. Yeah, it doesn't say. But also age can do really wonderful things to edge off a lot of that proof. Again, I've had a very secret bottle of 25-year-old bourbon that was 150 proof, and when they asked me to guess the proof, I said 115, and again, at 115, you're talking about a pretty high proof whiskey, but significantly different than 150.
And 150 is 75% alcohol.
Yeah,
that's
and it was delicious. It's also not available for commercial consumption, but
perks of being Jordan.
No, yeah, that one came through, and that was there's a mystery person in that because it didn't come from my mom, but or my brother-in-law. I guess that's for full disclosure, I guess that's a good thing to mention too. We have Maker's Mark on the table. My brother-in-law is now a chef in residence at Maker's Mark.
Oh, nice.
So it's given me reason to revisit Maker's as something that I keep. And again, I choose the cask strength when I do.
Oh, definitely.
I also like Maker's 46 a decent amount. It's bourbon, and then they again in one of these the one loophole-ish thing with straight bourbon and straight whiskey is you can't add any flavors. You can't add anything that doesn't come from the barrel. But bourbon, once it's aged in a new charred oak barrel, is bourbon, and then and I don't think that 46 is even marketed as a straight bourbon.
I don't think it is either.
And it might not even be marketed as a bourbon. I can't remember. But you see finishes. Sherry cask finishes, Madeira cask finishes, port cask finishes, that sort of thing. And those somehow, because they've been aged in a new charred oak barrel or whatever, they then finish them in one of these other barrels to add other flavor notes. And they still qualify as bourbon.
Right.
I think they still can qualify as straight, but I'm not sure about that. I'd have to go back and look. So that's another thing that you see a lot is these finished bourbons. And again, that's just taster's choice. I'm not a huge fan of sherry cask finishes. There are a few out there that I've tasted that I've been like, yeah, okay, but I'd still go back to regular bourbon.
And that's a whole nother episode, but it's another fascinating aspect of the blending and the finishing process. And it's actually a great way for new distilleries to actually put their fingerprint on something, which is what we talked about earlier in the episode.
Absolutely. When you're a young distillery and you're sourcing whiskey and what you want to be known for is your whiskey, one way to put your fingerprints on the stuff that you're not producing is to buy a barrel and do some interesting blending and all that stuff.
Right.
And,
So there are some admirable traits to it.
Or you just get really good at picking barrels like Willett does and sell single barrel projects every day.
Yeah, we don't have any Willett on the table, but Willett is a really good bourbon.
Yeah, and again, most of their, especially all their heavily aged stuff is barrels they bought from someone else, and then I know they've started producing their own rye. They're 2 and 4 year, and I want to say they have a younger bourbon out now too.
Yes,
yeah.
So that was a pretty good rundown of cocktails, and we'll put everything up on the show notes. I'll snap a pic of these bourbons, but you've already done the lightning round, so I've only got a couple of questions for you.
All right.
One is books on bourbon. What do we go?
All right, so my go-to, because it's not too long, and does a great job of going through the history and decent enough detail is Michael Veach's Kentucky Bourbon Whiskey and American Heritage.
Did you happen to interview him?
We did. We did a series of bourbon-related podcasts last September, because that's Bourbon Heritage Month.
Right.
And we interviewed him, last year as one of those.
That was a killer interview, and we're definitely going to link to all of those podcasts.
That was great. He has that book. I have a fun little touristy Kentucky bourbon cocktail book that gives you a lot of good ideas. It's actually where I found the Louisville cocktail. And then I don't know. Fred Minnick has Bourbon Curious, another excellent book. I think that between that book, Bourbon Curious, and Kentucky Bourbon Whiskey, and American Heritage by Veach, you cover your bases pretty well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'll snap a pic since we've actually got the physical books here. I'll snap a picture. We'll put those in the show notes, links to the Amazon links, and so you'll be set up on books. And then we got a new lightning round question.
All right,
and that is, if you were a cocktail tool or ingredient, what would you be?
Ooh, that's actually one that I remember reading on the list of questions that you gave me ahead of time that I didn't think about.
Right, it shows that we are more organized than it seems like we are sometimes.
But I think very quickly,
it can't be bourbon.
I'd have to say
can't be bourbon.
No, I'm not gonna go with. I'm gonna go with a piece of hardware. And I'm gonna have to say it's a. Yeah, I'm a shaker. Like,
nice.
And the why is just that it's like the most utilitarian piece of equipment that that you have on the bar. I mean, I guess there are arguments for other things, but I'm certainly not as delicate as a mixing glass, nor as transparent.
There are layers upon layers.
Yeah. And I'm not so intimidating to be a muddler. I like to be useful, and they also tend to be like the dirtiest piece of equipment at the end of the night, and maybe there's something to that too. I like to get my hands dirty, so. Yeah, I think shaker is the right answer there.
Yeah, I mean the shaker is like the Calvin and Hobbes transmogrifier of the cocktail world, right? Like,
you're using words I don't understand.
Well, I mean it's literally like things go in and then they come out all different, right? It's like it's now you see it, now you don't, now you see it again and it's different.
Yeah,
it's a beautiful little piece of equipment. So that's a really cool answer. Yeah. All right. We've beat the hell out of bourbon.
Yeah.
It is.
I talked your ear off.
I think we actually stood up rather well. I don't think it beat the hell out of us, despite what we did. But if anybody wants to check out the Speaking Easy podcast, or possibly digitally connect with you, where do they go on the interwebs?
So that's gotten significantly more limited since we're not as active as we used to be. I occasionally check the website. That's probably actually the best option. It's speakingeasypodcast.com. We have a contact link there. What I'd say is, if you've been trying to contact us on Twitter, good luck. It's not going to happen, so I won't even give you that one. And to be honest, the Instagram has been fairly inactive recently as well. It is at Speaking Easy Podcast. Maybe I'll check in the next couple of weeks. So, but really, it's come down to the website. I do check that not regularly, but every couple of weeks or so now. And we have not put up new content there since the end of last year. Maybe some of that changes in the near future. I'm not going to tease anything that I'm not willing to follow up on.
Sure. But there's a lot of content there, right? So it's a great resource, and that's the thing that you're underselling completely now.
So yes, the website does have show notes for all 106 episodes. Some are better than others, but they're all there. We have a few articles, probably a dozen or so, on different aspects of cocktail and drinking culture. We list some of our favorite cocktail bars in DC, so if you're local, that's great. It certainly could use a little bit of updating, but for most part, they're steadies for us. It's mostly show notes and then a few of our good ideas and a few recipes.
Right. SpeakingEasyPodcast.com and iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, all those places where you go to listen to podcasts. You can find the Speaking Easy podcast. It's actually easier to find the Modern Bar Cart podcast. So
there we go.
Yeah, you've got the iTunes reviews going strong. So if you're out there and you're listening to this, help me out.
Yeah, guys, if he's putting on a free show for you, and if you're enjoying it, the least you can do is go rate him on iTunes, because you don't understand. It's all part of that big data scheme. Like, it matters. He gets more notice if you guys who appreciate him go and give him a rating on iTunes. So please go do that.
Amen. And should we do the little gesture to the Speaking Easy right now?
You want to do a toast?
I want to do a toast.
All right,
let's do it. So this is a hallmark of the Speaking Easy podcast.
Yeah.
I'm going to. Why don't we do the here? Let's do the single.
All right.
I'll do a little splash of the single. Just a splash of the single.
Yeah, that
wasn't even a splash. So one of the hallmarks of the Speaking Easy podcast, of course, was, and this was mostly an Alex Luboff thing, because he had a book full of toasts.
Yeah, so he has a book full of toasts, which he loves, and they're long and poetic, and like the hallmark of the Speaking Easy podcast was, it was a story of before the podcast was ever even conceived. Me and a former romantic interest drinking buddy started toasting to being a better drinker a while ago. So to being a better drinker was kind of our end of the show tagline, hallmark. And so that's been a toast. That toast will probably stick with me for forever. Because I like it. It's sitting at a bar with good friends or whatever, and saying, "Here's to exploring what's new and better than the day we had before, what we had before." So,
all right. Well, I'll be your Alex Luboff then.
All right.
And this is going to be pretty cringeworthy, but it's actually fairly topical because it's been raining here in DC for the past 3 days nonstop.
Yeah. Building an ark out back.
Yeah, it's not good. Luckily, we're on what's called the quote-unquote Capitol Hill.
Yeah, there's a small incline.
Yeah. But so in honor of the rain and in honor of the bourbon episode, I will quote a popular tacky country song and say that rain makes corn and corn makes whiskey, and whiskey makes my baby, I believe, feel kind of frisky. so cheers to whatever happens there.
I don't know that song. I'm gonna have to look that up. I'm certainly no Alex Luboff, so here's to being a better drinker.
To being a better drinker. Cheers. Hey everybody, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, there's 2 big things you can do for us here at Modern Bar Cart. One would be to tell your friends and family if you think they'd enjoy listening to us talk about cocktails. And if they don't download podcasts, they can always stream our episodes on their desktop directly from the show notes page at modernbarcart.com. The other thing you can do to help would be to head on over to iTunes or wherever you download your podcasts and leave us a review. 5 stars are great, but we're more interested in your feedback. And the beauty is, the more reviews we have, the easier it will be for other folks out there to learn about our show. We're trying to start a cocktail revolution here, and by spreading the word, you're helping us fight the good fight. can always reach us by emailing podcast@modernbarcart.com if you're looking for cocktail or bartending advice, or if you're a pro who would like to pull up a mic and be interviewed for all to hear. Also, definitely follow us on Instagram and Facebook @modernbarcart for cocktail porn, recipes, and entertaining tips. And keep an eye out for new product releases and special offers, which are happening all the time. We love our listeners, and we really enjoy giving you exclusive discounts and sneak peeks at our latest and greatest cocktail projects. This episode may be over, but for you, the mixological fun and adventures are just beginning, so remember, folks, drink responsibly and experiment boldly. This episode was made possible with editing and production assistance by Samantha Reed, an excellent bourbon library courtesy of Jordan Wicker, and a little bit of interview magic by yours truly. This has been a Modern Bar Cart production, copyright 2018.